Welcome to another episode of We Are Carbon. I'm Helen Fisher and I'm joined by Richard Tufton to consider the reality of scaling up land regeneration through making shifts within the supply chain of meat. We've frequently heard about the role of ruminant animals in the healing of land and sequestering of carbon. I'll leave links at the top of the description to previous episodes that go into that in more detail. But with such huge numbers of livestock being raised in more industrialised feedlot systems, the narrative gets very muddied, with cattle frequently branded as the climate enemy. Richard shares that in the US alone, 120,000 head of cattle are slaughtered every day for meat production. That sounds horrifying, but it's a reality, it's where we're at right now, and it's a huge contribution to our food system. So this is a complex conversation that could take many directions. But our biggest focus in this discussion is that only a tiny, tiny percentage of those animals are regeneratively raised. Producing cattle in systems that are healing to the land is also proving to be hugely beneficial to the farmers who adopt those approaches. But there are big barriers to shifting things in that direction at scale. Whatever your views on meat, I think it's a conversation that everyone can take interest in. Because, as Richard concludes, ultimately, it's the consumer who has the power to change the system. He brings us insights from a career hands-on within the meat supply chain, first within his home country, the UK, and as Chief Sustainability Officer for one of the largest suppliers of natural and organic meats going into the US supermarket system. He helps us to mull over the challenges and what might need to be done to provide purchasers with both the convenience and the understanding to make choices that could really scale things up for regeneration. The most available path might be for each of us to take an interest and build our knowledge. So Richard shares some great additional resources for you to take a look at after you've listened. You'll find the links in the description. Right, let's get stuck in. Hi Richard.
Hey, good morning.
Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate that you're going to spend the time talking about essentially the meat industry and the supply chain within that today. Fantastic topic, and I wonder if you could start us off with just a quick introduction to yourself and maybe a bit of background into the work that sort of led you into this area.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks, Helen, for having me on this. First of all, I think your podcast series is really interesting, and I'm a big fan of your animations that you do. So yeah, amazing work with that. But yeah, so a little bit about me. So I've been in the meat industry for just over 2 decades. So I grew up in the countryside near Cambridge in England, and always grew up working on farms to make extra pocket money in the summer holidays. And that led to studying agriculture at Newcastle University, which is in the northeast of England. And from there, I got a job working as a graduate trainee for a large British-Irish meat company. And I was based at a slaughter and deboning operation in Yorkshire, not too far from where you are. And that gave me the opportunity to learn the whole process from how the animal is grown, but then also how is it slaughtered, how is it dry aged, where do all the parts and pieces come from? How does all that work? And then how do you supply that into the supermarket network? How do you pay the farmers? How do the supermarkets pay you? It was a really well-rounded, practical education as to how the meat industry works. And from there, I gradually got into sales, moved down to London and did that for 10 or so years. And then I got the opportunity to move over to the States, where I'm talking to you from now, in Austin, Texas, working for a large natural and organic meat supply, actually the largest over here in the US, doing the same thing. And my current role is Chief Sustainability Officer. So I'm trying to figure out ways that we can better raise meat for the future of the planet and for better health for the humans eating it and for the best animal welfare possible.
Fantastic. I find this a really interesting angle to come from, because not many of us think about how the meat is going on that journey to go from the farm to the supermarket. And I think a lot of us don't think about that because it's something we don't want to think about. Like you said, in the slaughterhouse and figuring out which parts of the animal things come from, it's a bit real for many of us, a bit too sort of connecting to our food, which is something we need to do more of, I think, in my opinion. I think it helps us to really get to terms with where things are coming from. But the thing with this podcast is we hear all the time about the beauty and the benefits and the opportunities of regenerative agriculture. It's a topic that we can't avoid it when we're thinking about a sustainable future. How we treat the land, the approach to farming, it is very much there as a solution to healing the planet whilst supporting our needs at the same time. Just a fantastic thing to get into. And today I'd really love to take this opportunity to delve deeper into this reality of the meat supply chain, because I think it helps us to get a better grasp of the challenges of making a transition. We have this wonderful opportunity of regenerative agriculture, but how do we actually get there at scale? And I think breaking things down, it's a really big topic, but breaking it down a little bit will help us to really picture what those challenges are, what those steps forward might look like. And I think that one of the key sort of areas to get stuck in with to start with, if we just have a sort of think about where we get this conflicting information. We hear, like I've just said, regenerative agriculture, fantastic solution, but we so often hear that animals are the problem when it comes to climate discussions, environmental discussions. Animals are actually the enemy in those kind of discussions, and yet in regenerative agriculture we often hear that animals are really huge integral part of the solution. So I think that's all to say, if we could sort of break this down a little bit and understand where that conflict's coming from, I think a great place to start would be to just centre it all about the climate and emissions and consider why we could consider animals to be the enemy and also the solution. Where does that crossover come from?
Yeah, well, I think you've got to bring it back to what a ruminant animal is, and cows are ruminants, which mean they have 4 stomachs and they have microbes and bacteria living within their stomachs that help them break down the food that they're eating, most of which is food that is not able to be digested by humans, which honestly is the main benefit long term in having ruminants and beef as part of the supply chain and part of food for humans, on the planet, because they're very good at taking foodstuffs like grass and turning them into high quality protein. But if you think about what the bacteria is doing in their stomachs as they're helping the cattle digest the food, their methane is a byproduct which the cattle belch out. They burp it out about once a minute for the life of the cow. And so the longer the cow lives, the more it's burping out methane. And methane is a greenhouse gas. And so it is easy for critics of the system to just point at the methane and say cows are bad because they emit methane and methane's a greenhouse gas. But if you do that, you're not considering the overall benefit that cattle and cows can have on a climate change if they're farmed in such a way to be classed as regenerative or sustainable, meaning there are plenty of other factors that they contribute other than just the methane coming out of their mouths, which is they're really helping the general health of the farms on which they're raised. In terms of the soil biology is a big one. And by having ruminants on your farm, you're helping the grass grow, because grass that is grazed by ruminants grows at a quicker rate than grass that isn't grazed by ruminants. So cattle need to be considered as overall contributors to a positive climate situation, because they're doing good for the environments on which the cattle are raised. They're feeding the soil biology. They're helping more grass grow, which in turn is photosynthesizing more sunlight and putting carbon and exudates into the soil, which feed the soil biology. So the overall picture of cattle is beneficial to that. But if you're just looking at methane, then they can be, if that's where you stop investigating, then that's why you're getting, a conflicting point of view on this. There are some actually really interesting ways that this is being helped in terms of how the cattle are being fed. There are some studies happening over here in the States about including additives in their feed, such as seaweed, which dramatically reduces the methane being emitted by them as they're being fed. That definitely works, but as of yet, there's no plan as to how you grow seaweed on such a scale and are able to distribute it effectively to, a farm in Illinois, miles from where seaweed could be grown. So that's, slightly problematic. But yeah, I think you have to look at them as a key part in growing the biodiversity of life on the farm and not just the methane that's being emitted.
That's fantastic. So in terms of the animal being a ruminant, this all comes down to the microbiology in its digestive system and then how that essentially is breaking down the grass. And I suppose that then, as you've touched upon, the different foods that animal eats, it's impacting what that microbiology is outputting or what's active and how the balance is. But overall, when we talk about regenerative agriculture, we are really wanting to nurture that soil life, and the ruminant animal can be a huge benefit towards that. I think I'd love to explore this conversation in terms of the different ways that the animals are produced, in terms of there are such vast ways that they kind of contrast how you can produce an animal to produce food. And I think one of the huge topics within this, I suppose it's a lot of noise. In my opinion, there's a lot of noise that gets in the way of productive conversation around regenerative agriculture and food, particularly meat, because it comes down to whether or not we should be eating meat. This sort of, is it good for the body? Is it good for the environment? Is it cruel to the animals? And it's a very complex topic. And to be honest, it's not something I want to delve into too deeply here. I think it's a topic for a different conversation. Whether we should eat meat or not, to my sort of best of what I could say in this moment in time, it's a very, very personal decision. It's very nuanced, and it's not something that we can sort of put a right or wrong on. However, what we can look at is those different ways that the animals are produced and how that impacts upon animal welfare. I think that's something that is very important for people to get a grasp of, to help them to make the right decisions for themselves. So when it comes to this, and we look at, perhaps we could call it industrialised meat production versus regenerative meat production, is there a big difference to the animal's experience within those two different ways of producing the meat?
Yeah, well, I think especially here in the US, where I'm talking to you from, famously food is produced in quite an industrial way, whatever the food is that you're looking at, because back in the 50s, post-Second World War, the way to get votes and to stay in power at the time was to give jobs to as many people as possible and make food as cheap as possible available for the masses. And so at that time, the system was set up to heavily incentivize the growing of corn, here in the States anyway, and that then got turned into ethanol to help cars go. It got turned into high fructose corn syrup, which has a lot of problematic things associated with it as a foodstuff. But it also got put into the cattle growing system, because we realized that if you fed cattle on grain and corn rather, they grew really quickly, but they also got sick. And so antibiotics became a big part of the food supply chain. Hormones became a big part of the food supply chain. And with that, it definitely raised questions on animal welfare. I'm not saying if it's right or wrong, but it's definitely, it can be problematic to some people and what they believe in. What I would say is that animals still spend most of their life on grass. Even here in the States, cattle that end up in a feedlot will still spend 2/3 of their life raised on grass before they go into a feedlot. And just to be clear, I think it might be useful to define what a feedlot is. And it's really a confined area where animals are being fed. Now, this might be a beautiful farm in Lincolnshire, near where you're talking to me from, and the farmer might have a barn where he puts the cattle in over the winter and feeds them barley. I mean, that's a feedlot because the gate is shut and the animals are in there eating barley or wheat or something. You've also got the huge feedlots here in the US where you might have 15, 20,000 cattle all in one location being fed corn. The definition of concentrated animal feed operations, or CAFOs, which means you have to have more than 1,000 animals on your feedlot to be classed as that. These are all different ways of doing it. And it's interesting because from a meat production standpoint, they're very efficient places. The other thing, which is a kind of complicated thing to get your head around and really answers your question, is the animal welfare aspect. If you look at probably the most famous person in the animal welfare space is Temple Grandin, and I encourage all of your listeners to watch the movie with Claire Danes, which came out a couple of years ago. Really good in understanding the impact that she had on animal welfare globally. Well, she came up through feedlot systems, and if purely your question is animal welfare and do the animals have a good experience, well, with all of the indicators, the answer is yes. Although visually, from our human perspective, when you see cattle in these big feedlots, often with no grass, and it kind of looks like a gigantic car park, and compare that to an animal on a regenerative farm, knee deep in grass with trees and birds and things, you think, oh, well, the welfare is going to be dramatically different. But if you look at the way that we measure welfare, for example, the 5 freedoms, which is an idea that came out of England several years ago, like freedom to display natural behavior, freedom from thirst, freedom from hunger, freedom from disease. Well, all of those boxes are checked in the feedlot system as they are in the regenerative system. So it is it's a complicated idea because visually they look very different, the systems. But when you look at whether the animal is happy, to all the ways that we know how to measure that, the animal is equally happy in both systems. But from a regenerative point of view, I think there are many challenges with the feedlot system because the cattle aren't grazing grass. They're not able to help promote soil biology. They're not helping with water infiltration or water holding capacity of the land that they're on. All of those things are taken away. But the other thing that's hard to kind of get your head around is because it's such an efficient way to feed animals, you're able to grow them quickly. It also means that they're emitting less methane because they're alive for a shorter period of time. So globally, livestock is responsible for about 11% of emissions of methane or carbon footprint. But in the US, that number's down to 4%. So it's quite a difficult, conflicting idea to get your head around, that actually the feedlots on the surface, they look quite overwhelming, scary places. But then when you think about it from a carbon emission point of view, it's such an efficient way to raise animals that it's conflicting. Anyway, it's definitely conflicting to me to kind of get my head around it.
Absolutely. As you're saying all of this, it's actually, I thought we would take the surface of this topic a little bit, and it would become a bit black and white. And actually, that isn't the case. It's much more complicated than that. There's so many layers, and everything you've said, it pokes up another layer. So the idea that you could say the methane emissions from that numbers point of view, the feedlot's benefiting the climate from the perspective of methane numbers throughout the lifetime of the animal.
Yeah, or you're saying it's doing less harm. I'm not sure that it's benefiting, because all of the positive, the environmentally positive things that ruminant animals can do are kind of being taken away, but you are doing less harm because you're emitting 4% emissions compared to globally, where that figure's somewhere like 11.
Yeah. And I think that, like I said, this is actually, we dig under the surface, it gets more complicated. So let's keep kind of going through this a little bit more, because I think that complication, let's throw it out and maybe we'll get some clarity again. I'm kind of taking a few things that you've said there, and I'm thinking that we can't look at this as simple numbers, because in the regenerative system, when the cow is purely grazing, the methane is surely part of that system then. It's part of the whole system. When that becomes an animal on a car park, essentially, or this industrial massive scale lot, that methane might be a smaller number in terms of there's less days of the animal's life to produce the steak. But what's happening with that methane? It's just going into a big pile, or it's not got the soil, it's not got the microbiology in that soil to be integrated. So I would argue right off the bat that it's a kind of, that those numbers are irrelevant, or they're the wrong numbers to be looking at, perhaps.
Yeah, that's right, because you have to look at it as a system as a whole. And going back to my days at university to get my agricultural degree, the essence of farming was relatively simple, that you get out what you put in. So if you want to have high crop yields as an output, then your input has to be fertilizer and herbicides and pesticides. And it was kind of like a chemistry equation. But I think there's more and more evidence to support the fact that agriculture should be seen as a biology system and not a chemistry system. And by feeding this incredible network of all of the fungal and bacterial life that exist under the soil, the more that you can feed that, the much better it is for the farmer whose land it is that you're farming upon. And ruminants are a key part of that. And if you can get that right, and you can use the animals as part of a maybe a multi-species system or a multi-crop system, you can really show dramatic improvements in your on-farm profitability. But you can also, in this day and age of seemingly constant drought and flooding, especially over here in the States, you can make your farm much more resilient to these extreme environmental effects, which are happening every year. You know, I was reading last week that for every 1% of soil organic matter on your farm per acre, you can hold about 20,000 gallons of water. So if you picture like soil like a sponge holding all that water, but for every 1% of soil organic matter you can grow, you can hold an additional 20,000 gallons of water on that same acre. And so therefore, if farmers become aware of things like that, it becomes more a question of, for example, working on your infiltration. So when the rain falls, making sure that every drop of that rain gets held on your land and not washed into rivers and streams, because you know that for the next month or two, maybe there's not going to be more rain, but you'll also know that that's been absorbed into your soil and is available for the roots of those plants to continue to grow, and the animals that are living on top of the land will continue to feed them, which in turn will help them grow more. You know, it's a whole system that you're trying to support.
Yeah, it's so wonderful that self-feeding system, and then the sort of round out benefits of the drought resistance and all of that goes hand in hand. It seems, in my mind at least, it seems like the direction that things should be kind of persuaded towards is that should become more of the norm, more of the sort of scaled up. The thing, like I said, the topic, I asked a sort of question expecting a black and white answer about the welfare. That didn't come through, because the answer is it's varied, so varied, and we can't really, like you've described, a feedlot, 20,000 cows, or it could be just a handful of cows that are behind a gate or fenced in on a night. That terminology doesn't really give us a black and white. So there's not a particular black and white here. But when we think about this cyclic system and nature being part of that, so the cows are eating the grass, they're eating the food that's right at their feet, and then they're benefiting that soil that's having those additional benefits. When you talk about the feedlot system, and you've mentioned the methane numbers might look great in the feedlot system in one particular viewpoint, but that isn't taking into account that food has actually, for the cows, got to be produced on a site elsewhere, or perhaps on the same farm in some cases, but it's got to be fertilized, it's got to be seeded, it's got to have the pesticides on, and then it's got to be transported and perhaps processed, I'm guessing. So all of that's an additional need, whereas on it's eating the grass on the field, none of that is actually required, or a small amount compared. I think that it's a challenging to get that black and white, but we can put things into different groups and help us to break this down a bit. One thing I'd like to go just one step back on, because it was interesting when you said it, is that the reason that the feedlots in America are so productive and that methane number comes down is because they're fed on corn, and through feeding them corn, they grow faster. So that the animal is growing faster. But is corn ever part of a natural diet to a cow? And how does that impact its digestive system?
Yeah, well, it isn't. I mean, corn is a grass. That's the category of crop that it is. So farmers will grow it on their own land to feed to cattle in a natural system, and cows would naturally eat corn, but they would eat the whole plant. So you picture the field of maize that's 7-8 foot high, and they would be eating all of that, not just the yellow sweet corn that's in the cobs, which ultimately is what the cattle are eating in feedlots. So it's about giving them, you remember I said at the start that they're ruminants, so they have bacteria, microbes within their stomachs. They thrive on roughage. That's what they need. They need cellulose to be able to feed on and break down to give the energy to the cow. That's what a ruminant is. And the challenge with giving them really high energy feed is that it can make them sick. And that's why antibiotics are a big part of the food supply chain, at least here in the States. In the UK, it's different. Antibiotics would just be used therapeutically. So if an animal gets sick, you treat it for the sickness with veterinarian assistance. Whereas here, at least for a lot of the meat that's produced, cattle get given antibiotics as a blanket treatment to stop them from getting sick from the food that they're going to eat. And then in addition to that, they have hormone implants, they're like clips in the ears to enable them to put on weight quicker. And so the companies raising those type of animals, everybody gets paid quicker because you're able to finish the animal, as in make it ready for slaughter, after about 20 months. Whereas if an animal is out just on pasture for its whole life, the grass-fed, grass-finished beef, it probably takes nearer to 3 years. So, it takes an extra third longer. And that's why, grass-fed beef is more expensive than corn-fed beef. So that brings up, another part of the equation is making sure that the food is affordable, not just to the wealthy, but to everybody. So it's a really complicated equation.
Absolutely. It's something that I suppose we could chew over from all different directions, but I'm finding it really interesting to have these insights. And so when it comes to grass-fed, the sort of underlining expense is that extra time to produce it. That tends to be the key, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because it takes because it takes about 1/3 extra time to produce grass-fed, grass-finished cattle. You need more land to do that, and just all of the costs associated with the day-to-day running of a farm go into that number. And it is just more expensive because you're having to spend an extra year or 10 months to get the animal ready for point of slaughter, to make sure that all the farmers are all trying to raise cattle that hit a certain bullseye, whatever that bullseye is, because ultimately they're raising the animals to be eaten and to be picked off the supermarket shelf. So they're all being given targets of how big an animal to raise, because that will affect the size of the ribeye steak that you pick up from the supermarket shelf. And if that ribeye steak is too big, you're not going to pick it up, maybe because it'll be too expensive. And if it's too small, you're not going to pick it up because you'd be worried that it's not going to be enough for your meal. So the whole system is kind of built on ultimately the consumer, and the consumer will dictate what the producer is producing. And so if you can tailor the system to work towards a bullseye that is a regenerative bullseye versus a conventionally raised bullseye, that's ultimately how the system will eventually change. So you as a consumer have the power to make that change by deciding what meat you're buying in the supermarket or which restaurant you're choosing to eat at. That ultimately feeds back to the whole system. And whilst the system will try to tell you, we want you to eat this, ultimately you've got that choice that you can either choose to buy a regeneratively raised steak or non-regeneratively raised steak. And that'll come down to lots of things, and money will be a big part of it. Maybe you can't afford to buy the regenerative steak, but that's ultimately what will determine the future of the meat industry, is what the consumer chooses to buy and how well they understand how that meat has been produced. And it's really complicated. And I guarantee that most people shopping for meat in the supermarket aisle probably buy the same thing every week out of habit. Maybe they're intimidated to ask more questions about it. I'm sure they find it overwhelming. And I think one of the biggest things we've got to do as a regenerative movement or as a meat industry is to educate the consumer to make more informed choices, so that you fully understand, if I'm picking up this pack of meat compared to this pack, what system am I actually supporting? And the same applies for all food. Like if you're picking up this pint of milk versus this pint of milk, well, what's the difference? There's a price difference there. So what does that look like further back in the supply chain? So I think one of the main takeaways from this conversation is I'd encourage everybody to be as curious as you can be to understand what it is that you're buying and choosing to eat, because ultimately that will dictate how things are produced.
I think that's incredibly important, and I think that really is the crux of this conversation. Is we've opened up the sort of discussion with what appears to be more complexity and more confusion. If people are listening to this trying to find clarity, they might actually have to step into that zone of, okay, it's not as black and white as what I was hoping. But I think that we have kind of identified what needs to be the case moving forward, and that's for people to understand that this is important and to be able to know how to recognize what the different meat is if they're going to the supermarket, or the different places that they can choose to purchase from. I think before we discuss that just a little bit more, I'd love to ask about the choices from the perspective of the farmer, because so much of this, it's a system that's in place and it's business. So we're taking a topic of animals and living creatures, but we are putting them into the scope of business. And everything about the production method is a bit conveyor belt. It's a bit how quick can we get them through the system, how prescriptive and predictable can that system be, and how uniform can the product become at the end. We are talking about business, and we kind of can't take that aspect away from it as much as maybe we would like to. It is about providing to the demands of the consumer in a way that is sensible and successful to business. And when it comes to food production, this is hugely incentivized and supported and guided by government and policy. It's different across the globe. But I wonder if there's any insights at all that you could offer from your experience on, is the farmer incentivized to take the feedlot route more so than the regenerative route, or is there a balance?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've definitely become smarter from a European point of view. When I was at college, we learned about the various subsidies that were in place to maximize production, and that was certainly the case worldwide, US and UK. All subsidies were in place to maximize production. Yield was the goal, but then it resulted in, butter mountains and milk lakes and that kind of terminology, which I remember from the 90s, when things got changed slightly and directed more at environmental benefits to the farm and not just yield. And I think that's good, but I definitely don't think it's gone far enough. Certainly here, that's still the case. There's a really interesting documentary that I urge people to watch called King Corn. It's a few years old now, but it's these two college students, and they really look in detail as to how corn is raised here in the States and why it is such a massive factor in how food is eaten over here. And one of the interesting pieces in it is that they calculate that for every acre of corn that they raise, they lose $20. So they lose $20 for every acre of corn that they raise, but the government pays them $28 for every acre. So overall, they come out $8 profitable for each acre of corn they grow. But yet, if you look at the system overall, without the subsidy, they're losing money. And so that's certainly not sustainable. And the thing which I find really interesting and why I love the regenerative movement so much is that it does help farmers farm to grow their profits and not to grow their yields. And it is a system that can feed humans worldwide if everybody was to do it. But it's going to take a long time to get there, because still all the subsidies are in place to promote industrial agriculture. And certainly over here, if you're a farmer and you want to, say, grow crops, well, you have to take a bank loan to do that, to afford the seed and the equipment to do that. And the bank won't loan you that money unless you also take out crop insurance. And so you kind of get locked into this system where it's hard to be nimble as a farmer or a producer, even if you're massively into the regenerative movement. There's a fairly decent chance that you can't afford to start that journey because you're locked into your bank loans, you're locked into crop insurance, and it's really hard to come out of that system. And it's certainly, personally, it would feel really risky to go into the regenerative system. Now, there are lots and lots of regenerative case studies of farms that have shown wherever you are in the world that you can make it work profitably to grow crops, cattle, whatever food regeneratively. And I strongly believe it is the way to go. But the system is certainly working against you. Now, there are positive things in place. There's a movement over here called Regenerate America, which is looking at trying to affect the farm bill, which I think goes to Congress later this year. There are people way more knowledgeable about that than me, but you can look that up. And I know that people over here, the guys who made the Kiss the Ground movie, are trying to at least put influence in that to try to further steer subsidies more towards sustainable futures for farmers rather than just maximizing yields.
Yeah, it's wonderful that is there, that initiative is there. There's so many fantastic things that are happening, and that there's change that is taking place. I have no doubt about that, and it's moving things in the right direction. I think something that struck me with what you've just said, and the first time that I heard this was not this conversation, but it's well worth sort of stepping back over, is this idea that with the subsidies, per acre, $8 profit. That's with the subsidies. Without the subsidies, there's a loss. Now all I can think of with that is, well, you're going to need an awful lot of acres to be making a living out of that. So this is about scale. And it kind of, in my mind, I think if you had an acre of land, you would just need a bit of creativity and ingenuity on that small scale to have all different ways that you could make money and make a business out of that, in a community sense, in a tourist sense, in a food production sense. There's a lot of sort of small scale things that you could do with that 1 acre that I would say would challenge that $8 profit quite satisfactorily. So it seems to me like this system is not only built on this sort of very rigid financial system, it's about scale also. It's hugely about scale. So in that regard, the industrial feedlot is going to naturally, it's going to have a lot more produce to offer the market than a small-scale regenerative farm. Is the system, therefore, the route to market for farmers, is it completely different for the regenerative, the small scale? Let's say this. So if we just talk on scale, is it beneficial to have a large-scale farm to get your meat into the supermarket?
Yeah, I mean, of course it is. The big challenge from the meat supply chain is that customers want every cut of meat available to them every single day of the year. And so that's really challenging. So you could come up with an amazing way to raise animals with all these terms and conditions attached, like it's got to be a certain breed, it's got to be fed a certain way, you've got to massage it 3 times a day and play at Mozart and things like that. But then you'll only end up with 2 or 3 animals a year, and no supermarket is going to take on a program like that. So you have to find ways that are scalable. And that's definitely one of the barriers to the regenerative movement, that there are so many different ways of raising animals set by the context of wherever your farm is located. So it's hard to introduce these blanket statements. Even, how do you define regenerative? Well, it's maybe to do with how much water is being infiltrated and can you grow that. It's maybe to do with biodiversity on your land, and is that growing or is it not growing? Is it to do with soil organic matter, like what percentage of carbon is in your soil? Well, for those 3 simple things, I bet most farmers globally probably don't know what those numbers are because they're not being tested currently, which means, as effectively the channel between the farm and the supermarket, we can't go to a supermarket and say this meat is regenerative, because they're going to say, well, we have to prove it is with facts and figures and numbers. And it's hard to get enough farmers together who are regenerative, because not enough of them know if they are or not, because up until now, the only measurement which has been important is yield. How much meat are you producing from your cattle per year, or how much yield, how many bushels of corn are coming from your land per year. That's been the main measurement as companies work out how to put programs together so that you as a consumer can eat the meat or eat the grain or the bread or the milk or whatever it is. And that's that's the biggest barrier. Now, is it harder to be a small farmer and be a part of the system? Yeah, it is, but it's definitely not impossible. I work for a company over here in the States. We're the largest supplier of natural and organic meats into the US supermarket system. And we have farmers who maybe give us 10 head of cattle a year, really small. And they're just as important to us as the guys who are giving us, 100 head of cattle a week. Because I guess my point is it's definitely not impossible. There are companies out there like the one that I work for who can help support that system, but it's definitely harder because you need the economies of scale, tractors, labor, land. It's expensive. And so you have to think about, well, what's your revenue going to be after you've spent money on your tractors and farm equipment and things like that? And the revenue is going to come from your yields and from the number of cattle that you can take from birth to slaughter every year and things like that. And so you want to spread out your fixed costs as wide as you can. And that's why gigantic farms are in inverted commas, taking over. Where I'm from in Cambridge, I saw farms going from being, say, 250 acres in size to 1,000 acres in size to 4,000 acres in size, and most of which would probably be farmed by similar kit because it is a more efficient way to farm. And I think we thrive on having that natural diversity of farms, both big and small, and that's what makes the countryside as beautiful as it is today. For that reason, I think it's definitely a risk that we're going to get to a stage where there are only going to be a few farmers left who farm masses of acres. Here in the States, the average age of a farmer is 68 years old. 68 years old is the average age of a farmer. And that, I guess, tells you what you need to know. Like it's really hard. It's hard work to be profitable as a farmer in the current system. I read last week that farmer debt right now with the current subsidy system grows at about 4% every year. So for every year, the average farmer is in debt 4% more than what they were the previous year. But that's not a sustainable way to do things. So, the system has to change, but that is what it is right now.
Yeah, that actually underlines the idea that, because I think that so much of this is in favour of the industrialised system. The way that things are, it's kind of built to support that, and yet what you're describing is a system that's not attracting the next generation, and it's not providing a satisfactory profit for the amount of work that farmers are putting into it. So in many ways, we could say that is also a push towards why we need something new. It's not just thinking about the climate or the animals themselves. It's not really working very well for the farmers, so we do need something new. And fortunately, although we've talked about the challenges a lot today, there are a lot of farms making the transition. There's a lot of farmers making the decision to change the way that they're approaching their land. And I wonder if you've got any insights on what you think might be motivating that for them on a sort of individual level.
Yeah, well, I think, remember what I said about subsidies really being geared towards yield only. Well, many modern regenerative techniques and practices are geared towards on-farm profitability, which does not equal yield. So when I referenced farming being a chemical equation, input equals output, well, trying to think of it as more of a biological, more of a kind of biology system, well, getting those inputs massively reduced. Corn is extremely expensive. Fertilizer is extremely expensive. So if you can farm in a way that reduces those inputs, then you will end up having slightly lower yielding land. Yes, whatever it is that your cash revenue, whether it's cattle, whether it's crops, whatever it is, but your profits will go up significantly. I've read studies of regenerative farms here in the States where the yield will drop by 29%, but the profit will go up by 78%, because what you're doing is you're eliminating the need for expensive inputs, and you're farming in such a way that you're using free inputs. You're making better use of the rainfall. You're making better use of the soil biology. You're making better use of the sunlight that falls on your land and converting it into energy that can grow the grass or grow the crops or whatever the revenue is. So there's definitely a positive return, whether you believe in climate change and doing what's right for the environment, or whether you believe in making money for your family. That those two things go together. It's really hard to get to that jumping off point as a farmer to start on that system with the way things are set up. But if you're brave enough to do it, there are enough people out there that have shown that it's a profitable income for your family. It's really beneficial to wildlife. It's really beneficial to welfare. It's really beneficial to soil health. It's really beneficial to resilience on your farm, to flooding and to drought. So there are plenty of upsides to it. It's just you've got to be brave to get to that jumping off point.
It really does sound like that bravery is something that is well worth the, I suppose, think of it as an adventure, not a gamble, and try to get involved in the community, even online. There's so much support for sort of sharing knowledge and experience in this field, and it's such a very dynamic area.
It is still small. I think I'm definitely guilty of surrounding myself on my social media, who I follow in this space, and you kind of think that it's taking over the world. But when you zoom out, just let's talk cattle numbers for a second. So every single day here in the States, about 120,000 head of cattle are slaughtered for meat production. 120,000. Now, if you look at the natural market, so those which don't use hormones and antibiotics, that's probably 3,000 or 4,000 per day, tiny number. And then you look at the grass-fed, grass-finished, you're probably looking at 400 a day, something like that. And then if you further on top of that have those that are regeneratively audited and approved, it would be a fraction of that. So I say that just so that you understand, like, the scale of it is still really tiny, and there's it's growing rapidly. It is growing rapidly. And going back to what I said about you, the consumer who's buying the meat, ultimately you have the power to change the system, but it's starting from a really small base, and it's growing quickly for sure. And there are some great indicators out there. I mean, the biggest retailer in the world, Walmart, now has grass-fed beef on the shelf, and that is a great indicator that they've recognized that enough of the population are interested in eating beef grown from a system where the animal's just eating grass. Well, that's really interesting. And so that shows that the needle is starting to move. But we've obviously got a long way to go, because we're still, single percentage points of the total market are in this space. So I think it's valuable work. It's really important work. But we also have to understand that we're a really tiny percentage of the total market. And to make a difference, we've got to try and shift the needle further. But many good things are happening to push us in that direction.
Yeah, thank you for those statistics, because that is very stark. It's very easy to see that the scale of this is, it's just this tiny little thing in the corner. And as you've said numerous times, it can be down to the consumer to say, hang on a minute, I'm going to get involved, I'm going to get informed, and I'm going to go and look for food that supports and make that clear to the supermarkets, to the shops you're buying from. And I think, as you've mentioned yourself, in this sort of bubble within your social media and thinking that regeneration is taking over the world, I think that we can very, very much, I kind of can be guilty of that too. And the other thing that goes side by side with that is to just indicate, in this discussion we've talked about supermarkets an awful lot. One of the really obvious solutions is to skip the supermarket, in my opinion, is to go more localized, farmers markets, direct from the farm. That would be the easiest way to have this discussion. But the reality is that scale, if you want to scale it up, you've got to bring the supermarket into the conversation, because the consumer at large needs the convenience and they need the routine that they're used to in order to integrate this change into their lives. We're not talking about small percentages. We want to kind of make sure that this is taking over the world. And if that was possible, I suppose that the method that you've discussed that you've sort of touched on a little bit about the work that you do, the role that you play at the moment, you're bringing together smaller and medium-sized producers and bringing those through into one distributor. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So you need more, you need companies in the middle, like the one that I work for, to aggregate all of the small producers to form an offering, so that, remember, as humans, we want convenience. We want to go to the grocery store 24 hours a day, and when we get there, we want to have the full selection of meat available. And so in order to do that, remember I referenced we work with people who maybe give us 10 head per year. Well, I need lots of people like that, spaced evenly through the year, to enable you as a consumer to go to the supermarket whenever you want to get the products that you want from it. And so it's difficult. It's a challenging system, because often people do want to raise meat in a better way than what it's being raised right now. But the speed bumps in the road are that you have to have something available every week of the year, whether you're a restaurant, whether you're a supermarket, or even if you're, e-commerce doing direct shipping. And the other challenge is that there used to be a network of small slaughterhouses, whether it's the UK or whether it's the US, and increasingly the smaller ones have shut, because in order to have the best welfare possible, the best technology in place to slaughter the animal in as a pain-free way as possible, it's expensive. Like, all of that kit to do that properly is expensive. And the other juxtaposition is that you have the bigger slaughterhouses are often the ones with the best welfare, because they've got the money and the economies of scale to afford the best way to unload the animal off the truck, or the best way to accurately slaughter it as quickly and as pain-free as possible. All of the kit and the latest technology is really expensive. And so your small regional slaughterhouses that are maybe only processing 5 or 10 head a week, they can't afford that kit. So it's difficult. It'd be great to have a system where everything is hyper local, but unfortunately, it costs money to get the best facilities possible. And so that's, another reason why the bigger slaughterhouses are getting bigger, and the small slaughterhouses are dying out. And we definitely saw that in COVID. It was really challenging because suddenly here in the States, you couldn't get animals across state lines, and there wasn't enough capacity at the fewer larger slaughterhouses. And there was demand to go back to a system where you had more smaller regional slaughterhouses, but it's expensive. And I think there are grants and systems in place to try to return slightly in that direction. But again, it's about subsidies. It's about governments taking the view that that's important for sustainable agriculture. And yeah, we'll have to see what happens.
Yeah, it's a really big picture. There's so many layers to it that I think the consumer is oblivious to, just for the fact that it's not going to come under their awareness. It's not really questions that they're likely to ask. But I absolutely agree with you. I think that the consumer is at the sort of forefront of the change, in that it's about scale, and we can figure out solutions for a small sort of quantity and a small system, we can introduce bespoke solutions. But if we're going to do it on scale, then it's the consumer that drives it. And do you feel that this is about, should we be educating consumers about the value of the full animal rather than expecting a very specific and standardized cut of meat? Or do you feel that comes into it at all?
Yeah, I do. I think another thing which I find a staggering statistic is here in the States, 41% of meat gets thrown away. That's after it's reached, whether it's the restaurant or the supermarket, or whether it's at your home, because meat is so cheap that it becomes something that consumers don't think twice about whether they're going to eat it or throw it away. And I think that's a really scary statistic when you think at how much trouble all the farmers go who deeply care about their animals, deeply care about the environment and the next generation coming through and all those kinds of things. And it takes them maybe as much as 3 years to produce the cattle for the beef. And then it just takes somebody making a bad purchasing decision, or something sits in the back of the fridge and goes bad. And you think, well, it's not that expensive, so we'll just toss it in the trash. But I think we've got a lot of work to do as a in the way that we think about food, and being more efficient as to how we eat it and enjoy it. And, maybe not having meat every single day of the week, but having it less frequently, but paying a little bit more for it to make sure that you're getting meat from the best possible source. And, as I said before, just being curious, like really understanding where the meat comes from that you're buying, and perhaps questioning if, meat is really cheap. Why is it cheap? And is that a system that I'm comfortable supporting? And but I do think in terms of regenerative meat, there's clearly like a shelf price jump right now, because it hasn't yet reached that tipping point. So here in the States, if I want to buy conventionally raised, industrially raised ground beef, say, so mince meat, it's maybe going to be $3 or $4 a pound to buy, the mass produced product. Well, if I want grass fed, I'm maybe going to be paying $6 a pound, something like that. And if I want organic grass fed, it's maybe going to be $8 a pound. And if I want regenerative, it's probably going to be about $12 a pound. Something like that is going to be around about what the market is right now. So it's maybe 4 times more expensive to buy regeneratively raised ground minced beef on the shelf compared to conventional. So you've got to be kind of committed and really understand it and believe in it to buy it right now as a consumer. But I kind of liken it to the electric cars, right? When the first electric cars, the first Teslas came out in California, only a handful of people had them. They were really expensive. and you probably had to be a firm believer in the electric car movement to buy one. But at some point, it reached a tipping point of scale where they could produce enough using whatever kit is needed to produce a car, that the cost per car got to a level where suddenly it became commercially viable as a buyer of a car. Instead of buying a petrol gas car, it became cheaper as a consumer to buy an electric car, because suddenly you didn't have the gas costs and you only had to service it once a year instead of once every few weeks, or whatever it is. Commercially, consumers were steered into the direction of buying electric cars because it became affordable compared to the alternatives. And I think regeneratively raised meat will get there. It's just going to take time. And I think right now we're at the stage where, like I said, you've got to be affording $12 a pound, about 4 times more than what conventionally raised meat is. So you've really got to believe in it at point of purchase as a consumer. And the more people that do, yes, it will help the regenerative movement grow, and it will help encourage more farmers raise their cattle that way. But we're still quite early in the process. And so I think the most important thing right now is to talk about it, is to tell your friends about it, is to have these discussions, hard or easy, about climate change, about the importance of livestock in the supply chain, and helping to enrich soil and get the most from ranchers' land and make more grass grow and really do well for your farm in terms of growing the biodiversity and the species that you're supporting. And the more we can have those conversations and get that message out there, it'll help educate people so that at point of purchase, maybe they think, well, instead of buying my $3 ground beef 7 meals a week, maybe I'll just have 1 meal a week and I'll spend money on the $12 ground beef, because I've now understood what regenerative actually means and the good that it will do for the environment, for the rural sustainability of the welfare of these small family farms, to keep that going, because actually that is something that is attractive to me and something that I want to support. And maybe I do have children and I want them to live in a world which is also flourishing and prosperous and doesn't have more droughts and more flooding, but actually we're doing something to try to reverse a lot of the damage that we've done. So yeah,
it's a huge topic, but it's been very nicely, succinctly covered there by yourself. And I suppose there's so many potential avenues that we can take to improve things. And if we know what the ambition is and we know which way we want to be headed, then that's a really good starting point. I think waste as a massive sort of headline is something that we need to look at from not just the consumer's point of view, which was quite shocking, the figures that you said there of what gets thrown away, but the industry on the whole and across the whole supply chain. I think there's always potential to put benefits. And when you think about the meat being so undervalued and so underpriced that it is discarded as oh well, I'll just pop it in the bin. You wouldn't do that if you was valuing it to pay those higher prices. So maybe we're just looking at the wrong figures. Maybe the aspiration isn't that. And then that comes into a whole other discussion, because it's difficult. People are at a different position, whether they can afford to throw food away, whether they can afford to pay a little bit more. But on the whole, there's huge potential for learning and for improving things. And another discussion, maybe for another day, it sort of strikes me that something that is desperately needed is greater clarity in how we communicate. Like, you are in the supermarket looking at that product. How do you know? I mean, we've just had this conversation about how many different terminologies there are and what falls under those terminologies. It's difficult to know at that point of purchase what you're supporting. And I think the idea of a middleman that is doing the work for you and helping identify, yes, these are fantastically produced farms. They know the farmer directly. They put that brand, and you can go to them. I think that's a really good kind of option.
Yeah, and it's supremely complicated, and your average consumer spends about 3 seconds deciding for example, which pack of ground beef to pick up. And then those 3 seconds as a retailer, as a seller of meat, you have to try to communicate why you should pick up your pack of meat versus somebody else's. And you have to communicate that it's antibiotic free, it's hormone free, it's a certain breed, it's been fed grass for its entire life. It's been, rotationally grazed. You have to try and compact all that messaging into a 3-second understandable message. It's supremely complicated. And so that's why it's really important to have these conversations. And I find wherever I go, people want to talk about meat, whether you like meat or you don't like meat, whether you eat it or whether you don't. Everyone has an opinion about it. And I think it's really important just to try to get as many facts out there as possible and help people understand that there are so many different ways to raise cattle, and many are really beneficial to the environment. And it's about having a better understanding of how food is produced, period. Meat, milk, butter, bread, whatever it is, having a better understanding of that has got to be important, and will and I think it needs to be in people's consciousness, because everyone has an opinion about it, but often these opinions are based on things that aren't accurate. And so I think trying to take the mystery out of it is really important.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that underlines everything, really. Trying to take that mystery out of a topic that's so complicated. But you've highlighted a couple of documentaries throughout this, which I'll ensure we've got links to so people can pop over and learn a bit more if they'd like to dive in. Do you have any other recommendations on how people can take a role within all of this?
Yeah, I've got tons, and I think anybody who knows me, I'm guilty of always trying to recommend things to read and watch. But I'll give you a few now. There's an amazing climate scientist over here called Catherine Hayhoe, and she has this really good book out called Saving Us. And I think that gives a really good, balanced, practical overview as to the state of things right now and actionable things that you can do to try and help make a difference. So that's one recommendation. Another couple of books that have been really influential on my life and the career path I've chosen. There's an author called Mark Schatzker, who's a really interesting journalist, and he wrote a book called Steak. It's a few years ago, but still as relevant today. And the essence is he goes around the world eating steak and then exploring how that steak came to his plate. Like, how was the animal grown? What was it fed? And what differences did he notice in how it tasted, the experience he got, but also the experience that the animal got. So that's Mark Schatzker's Steak. He also wrote another book called The Dorito Effect, which is really fascinating, looking at how processed food can affect the impact that food has on your body, and how important it is to try to really understand what the food is that you're eating and how it's made. So that's the second one. I referenced the King Corn documentary, really interesting, just understanding how corn has influenced food, especially here in the US. There is the Netflix documentary, Kiss the Ground. I know you've had one of the guys on your podcast, so probably your listeners are well aware of that. There's also a really good YouTube series called The Carbon Cowboys, which loads of little, 15-minute mini movies looking at people doing really good work in this space. So yeah, I think those are my recommendations, and there are tons of podcasts like yours out there. But yeah, as I said, I think it's all about being curious, especially when you're deciding whether to purchase meat, whether not to purchase meat, but what meat you're going to purchase or what food you're going to purchase. I think there's tremendous importance in making those decisions and thinking and being mindful of what system it is that you're supporting by where you're putting your pounds or your dollars, because that ultimately is going to change the system to the way that we want to change it, because producers produce food that is going to be consumed, and if it's not being consumed, then they're going to alter the ways that they're producing it. So ultimately, we've got the power. It just takes a big collective to, make those decisions.
Absolutely. Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for all those references and everything that you've shared with us. It's really very insightful, and I hope that people have found something of interest and can dig in a little deeper and have an extra think about what they're choosing to purchase. So, thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been really good fun. Thank you.
And thank you for listening to this episode of We Are Carbon. New episodes are added every other Tuesday, so don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date. It's a huge help to the show if you'd like to add a thumbs up or a review on whichever platform you're listening on. And let's keep figuring this all out together.